How's it going, everybody? In this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about how the mind sort of functions as a landscape. We're going to sort of unpack that metaphor a little bit more. So in the last video, I kind of gave an overview of the full process. In this video, we're going to focus more on how the mind sort of maps to a landscape. And I think the most useful thing to sort of think about here is the difference between climate and features, right? If you think of a landscape, you think of a tundra or something, there is a climate that goes with that, right? There's a set of weather patterns that emerge, and then based on those weather patterns, there are certain features that are more or less likely to be common. I think another good example is like a rainforest, right? Because of the amount of rain, there are certain plant life and other things that are likely to be there. And not only that, there are certain things that are likely to thrive in that environment. The mind works somewhat similarly, right? We each have sort of a baseline, right? Our temperament. And within our temperament, certain things are more likely to happen because of that. So, for example, you may be predisposed to anger at a higher level than I am, right? And this is the same as, if we're looking at a desert versus a rainforest, right? These climates are more likely to have rain or less likely to have rain. In the same way, you may be more likely to experience anger, or you may experience anger at a deeper level more easily than I do. This is sort of what is ingrained, right? Some of our baseline traits. Now, the other part, the features, right? What's likely to grow there. So if we're talking about trees, well, just because trees are likely to grow in a rainforest doesn't mean that they have to, right? You could go through and clear every single tree in the rainforest and then there wouldn't be any. Similarly, in a desert, you could grow a tree, but it's going to take much more effort because of the climate that's there. So in the same way with our minds, if you think about something like being prone to anger, right? You may be more likely to feel that emotion, but whether or not you actually do something like exhibit violence, right? If you act out in some sort of aggressive way, that is largely dependent on sort of the habits that you've built up. So to keep expanding this metaphor, the features of a landscape are sort of like the habits in our mind, right? There are certain actions or patterns of action that are more likely depending on your genetic baseline. However, none of these actions or reactions are determined by your baseline. So there are a number of different things to sort of pick apart to really get at the nuanced details there. But at a high level, some things will be ingrained and part of your genetic code, and some things, many things, your actions and reactions will be based on the rest of what happened, right? It's this very common nature versus nurture type of debate. Now, one of the things that's useful as you're looking to shape your mind is to keep this in mind, right? This distinction, and pay attention to sort of the things that are part of your natural baseline and the things that are actually patterns or habits you've built up over a long time. Now, this can get tricky, particularly with things that you have done for a very, very long time. So, for example, if you were predisposed to being shy, right? Predisposed to basically find social interaction uncomfortable, and then over the course of 10 or 20 years, you had interactions that when that was uncomfortable, you exhibited behavior that made that more uncomfortable, you never really learned the tools that you need to sort of overcome that, then you may think, oh, I'm just naturally not good with people, when the reality is the actual baseline was sort of this discomfort around high levels of social stimulation. So as you are sort of thinking about your mind, right, and the different ways to shape your mind and unpack certain things, try to parse out some of these different pieces, because it's going to be really useful to go, okay, I might be predisposed to anger, but this pattern of, getting in fights or starting fights or conflicts or whatever else, that's something I can work on. I can work on managing the anger, right? The feeling will still be there, but I can work on ways to sort of resolve that faster. Or I can work on setting up scenarios so that I'm less likely to get into these situations that really bring it to a high level. And the reason that this piece is so important is that as you're working to shape your mind, you figure out the levers you can pull, right, to change your behavior and outcomes, and the ones that you can't. And as you sort of those things out, you get more and more control over the options that you have. There's one other thing that I wanted to touch on in this video, which is another reason that minds are like landscapes, and that's because they're both constantly evolving, right? If you think of a landscape, we'll go back to the example of a forest. There's always going to be trees growing and little plants and grass and all these things happening all over the place. You can spend a good amount of time focused on one particular area, but while you're doing that, other places, things are going to continue changing and evolving. The same is true for your mind, right? Every action, every interaction, every little thing that happens is constantly changing your mind. And so while we have the ability to go in and make really good progress, right? We can go in and clear out a huge chunk of the forest and really focus on building a house there or something. And that will change a large portion of it. But in other places, these things are still going to be changing and evolving and adapting. So even though we can largely influence our minds and shape them, we're never going to be able to fully control them, right? You would never be able to take like an acre piece of land and control every single little interaction that happens there. But you could really change a bunch of the large features and then start paying attention to some of the smaller ones and do some rearranging there. So the main thrust here is that while we can make these changes, there will always be things happening and changing. In the same way, like if you left a forest for 20 years and then came back, or like one specific plot of land and then came back, it's going to be different. Your mind is sort of the same way, right? The stuff that we don't tend to actively can still evolve and change through sort of the other things that we're doing. So the main point is to not get focused in on this idea of control, right? This idea of 100% of the time, I will get my brain to do exactly what I want it to do. Instead, it's much more useful to think about like, what are the major projects I can do? What are the ways that I can sort of change this overall landscape to be something more like I want, but not get so detailed and granular as to think like, oh, I only want plants with 3 leaves, and if they have 4 or 5, then I'm going to have like a big problem. So hopefully that helps give a couple more points or reasons or ideas around how the mind operates much like a landscape, right? How that metaphor is sort of useful as you think about improving your life, improving the outcomes, and the way that you sort of interact with things. There are a number of other topics for us to cover, but I think that helps set sort of a baseline understanding so that you can start using this metaphor to think about the way that you're going to shape your life and your mind. That's all I've got for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com, and if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well, and that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.